Maintaining justice. We must thoroughly investigate any accusation of wrongdoing against a member of the body of Jesus Christ. Here's Gene.
Moses deals with this when he says in chapter 19, verse 15, one witness cannot establish any wrongdoing or sin against a person, whatever that person has done. A fact must be established with the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And the reason Moses had to say that is there are people that will make false statements. There are people that have evil desires and they want to set somebody up so they can benefit. Or they want to get even with somebody. And they will start a rumor. And so that's been around since year 1. And it certainly was true among the Israelites. And that's easy to understand in view of their carnality and some of the things that they were doing. And so they established this guideline. And it's interesting that when you get to the New Testament, you have Paul basically referring back to the same guideline in chapter 5 of 1 Timothy, verse 19. Don't accept an accusation against an elder unless it is supported by 2 or 3 witnesses. And there, of course, we could expand that, but here he's saying, in essence, don't accept an accusation against a spiritual leader or anyone, really, unless it is supported by 2 or 3 witnesses. In other words, when there's an accusation, you need to make sure it's true, because there are some people, even today, who call themselves Christians, who will start a rumor and who will attack somebody in order to try to bring them down. And that is really sad. There have been some parents who've been accused of sexual abuse that have not engaged in that practice because of a hatred of a child towards parents to bring them down, or self-deception. And that's a tragedy. I've seen that happen, and even in Christian families. Generally, that can happen in the ministry. You know, a pastor is vulnerable because if you're dealing with sin and people don't like it, one of the easiest things in the world to get even is start a rumor. Christians or leaders are vulnerable, always have been. And so that was Paul's dealing with that. Don't accept an accusation against a spiritual leader unless it's supported by 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, it may be true. And if it is true, then publicly rebuke those who sin. I think there it's saying in front of the other spiritual leaders so that the rest will also be afraid. In other words, Timothy, make sure that you deal with this if it is true. So what you need to deal with it, and what you have here is, first of all, protection, and you also have confrontation. But you need to keep this in balance and work this through in a very cautious way in terms of dealing with false accusations. Now, by the way, let me simply say that a victim can be a witness. And the reason I mention that is that there are some who've polluted this to cover up their own sins. And that leads to the reflection-response question. And then I'll give you an illustration. When one person accuses another of sexual abuse, take that as an example. When one person accuses another of sexual abuse, why is it important to investigate this charge thoroughly even when there are no other witnesses? And one of the reasons for that is sexual abuse is private. Where are you going to get witnesses to sexual abuse if you don't trust the witness? Now, the reason I mention that is that I was involved in a church situation helping them to recover from a horrible situation with a pastor who ultimately was caught in open homosexual behavior. In fact, it was so open he was caught in a bathhouse. But while he was the pastor of this church, he was practicing his homosexuality. And when a witness came forward and said, this man approached me inappropriately, the pastor said, where are the 2 or 3 witnesses? Where are the 2 or 3 witnesses? There are no witnesses to that kind of activity. So the witness himself or herself needs to be taken very seriously And in this case, by the way, there was more than one witness to what he was doing. And even then, there were some who interpreted in the leadership of the church, there are no witnesses to that activity, so how do we know these people are telling the truth? It was a cover-up and a perversion of this principle. And that's why this question is worded the way it is. When one person accuses another of sexual abuse, why is it important to investigate this charge thoroughly, even when there are no other witnesses? Now, the fact is, there are people who accuse others of sexual abuse just to get even, and it has to be investigated very carefully. But the fact is, that person, chances are, is telling the truth. It has to be investigated very, very carefully. And you have to take that very, very seriously. And that's why this principle of maintaining justice is just as relevant today as it was back there in the Old Testament. We must thoroughly investigate any accusation of wrongdoing against a member of the body of Jesus Christ.